Thank you for having me. Good afternoon, everyone. My presentation is titled Politics of Intellectualism and Archival Policies, Studying Women's Genres in Kerala. So let me start with a question. Why should one study the archives? The archive as a site of memory, history, and politics has been the subject of much critical study and contestation. Most of these critical engagements with the archive that looks at it as a physical repository of tangible sources are also acutely aware of the more intangible ideational structures that curate what should be archived. And given this, the archives need to be approached as a system of discourses which are in conversation with a larger continuum of ideas of the present and the past, and not simply as a segment of the past that is frozen in time. Even as the archive emerged as a crucial site of contestation to its hegemonic underpinnings and curatorial politics, its presence as a significant socio-discursive site is often instrumental in giving more intelligibility to the epistemic structures of mediate, the mundane, familiar, and conventional, and how they're reproduced. And this is, I would say, this might be one of the reasons why it is necessary to read alongside and against the archives, so to speak. The hypothesis of this particular paper is that certain class and gendered impulses mediate the process of archiving, or to put it in other words, archival practices within Kerala embodies the state's culturally rooted assumptions about gendered and caste sensibilities, revealing a certain politics of intellectualism that mediate the archival worth of print commodities. And hence, the paper attempts to define the term archivability and politics of intellectualism in the context of Kerala. Uh, so, as Arjuna Padre observes, the politics of value is in many contexts a politics of knowledge. So, in this context, the paper takes the absence of certain materials from archival histories as a point of departure to argue that archival worth is not inherent to a commodity. Rather, it is primarily attributed to a print commodity on the basis uh, of the specific demography with which it is popularly associated. The paper reiterates Anjali Arandekar's question: can an empty archive also be full? Or to put this in other words, what does an empty archive signify? Does it solely suggest an absolute dearth of materials, or does this absence provide insight into the culturally constructed discursive filters that validate some ideational paradigms? Hence, the paper attempts to understand the cultural assumptions underlying ideas pertaining to the archival worth of materials. So, it is in this context that this particular paper tries to ask the question: can gender be a useful analytical category in gauging the politics of archival policies? So, in order to delve into these questions, the paper aims to study how women's magazines, especially those that are derogatively regarded as periodicals, which are Manorama, Mangalam, and Manorajam, are archived in the state of Kerala. Through semi-structured interviews with the librarians of public universities and libraries in Kerala, the study attempts to understand the guiding principles that structure archival practices in the state, so as to understand the underlying gendered, classed, and gendered biases. In addition to this, the paper also attempts to understand what qualifies as knowledge and what falls outside the bounds of knowledgeability by parsing some popular discourses on the same. So, by carrying out the study in the backdrop of Kerala, a state where the incongruence between the high indices of gender development and the lived social reality of women have captured much academic attention, the paper aspires to understand if the biases undergirding the archival practices in Kerala could be connected to the social agency ascribed to women in the state. The next section is titled Archival Practices in Kerala. So, at the outset itself, the paper acknowledges that the range of resources that have been collected and archived in various libraries in Kerala is too vast and scattered to be covered within the scope of a single paper. The archival policies and resources collected vary from library to library according to the institutional affiliation, funding received, infrastructure support, and the public that they attempt to cater to. Given this a paper, the present paper gives exclusive focus to libraries and institutions that have consistently subscribed to popular periodicals during the last 4 decades or more. As a study attempts to comprehend if there is an androcentric bias mediating the archival policies in contemporary Kerala, the paper has selected some public libraries and university libraries for the present study. The libraries are Kerala State Central Library in Trivandrum, Kerala University Library Palayam, Thrissur Public Library, Appantampuram Smaraka Vayanashala run by the Sahitya Academy, Sri Chitra Tirunal Grandashala Vanchur, Mahatma Gandhi University Library Kottayam, Kottayam Public Library, Sri Shankaracharya University of Sanskrit Library, and Ernakulam Public Library. Though this list does not exhaustively cover all the libraries that subscribe and make available some of the popular periodicals and newspapers, the selection was necessitated by the rationale that this would be instrumental in looking at the archives as a physical and ideational space that leaps beyond the bounds of academic interest alone. Because while university libraries archive and preserve resources primarily for research and reference purposes, public libraries archives cater to the demands of a more diverse reading public. That is the reason why the list of libraries are a little bit diverse. So, in the context of archival practices in Kerala, P.K. Rajashekharan, a renowned literary critic, has said that lots of invaluable resources like old magazines, books and journals have been lost to posterity because of space constraints, infrastructural limitations, etc. But more than that, one of the reasons why these resources have been lost to posterity is also because of an underestimation of the archival value of these resources. So it is in this context that the present paper attempts to situate women's magazines and mark periodicals in particular, so as to understand the relative worth and significance of these periodicals as compared to other popular periodicals in the state. So the study tried to circulate certain questionnaires to the librarians. So some of the questions that were asked to librarians were, does a library have a strong archival policy or not? And if so, what are some of the oldest publications archived? And then the criteria, or on what basis does a library decide what should be archived and what shouldn't be? Then does a library consider a periodical socio-cultural significance an important factor that decides archivability? Or does a library think that only materials that have a certain educational value should be archived? So these questions I believe, would provide certain seminal insights into what qualifies as knowledge worth revisiting. So through the study, it was observed that all the libraries taken for the study considered socio-cultural significance and educational value as crucial factors that influence their archiving logic. And also some of the oldest publications that were archivable, it was observed that they have archived resources from the 19th century onwards. And but on closely scrutinizing some of these materials, is very evident that these magazines that were archived, for example, Unni Nambudiri or M.N. Nair Masika or Satyananda Kahalam, these periodicals also serve as mouthpieces of certain dominant class or caste communities in Kerala. For example, they represent the interest of the Nair, Nambudiri, and Syrian Christian communities. So there is a reason why these magazines were in circulation and why it was easier to procure. And also these magazines had a certain pedagogical agenda underlying it. So it had a certain social function. So it also kind of ticks the earlier criteria that the librarians said. That is, of course, the materials should have a certain educational and social cultural significance for it to be archived. So then coming on to the next section, which is about the archiving of women's magazines in Kerala. While attempting to study women's magazines, its mass appeal and low cultural value in Kerala, it is imperative to go beyond definitions of women's genres situated within the discourse of Paingley fiction, a genre that accrues meaning within the cultural context of Kerala. So let me just briefly outline what Paingley fiction means. The emergence of Paingley fiction or Ma periodicals in general is coterminous with the democratization of education in Kerala towards the second half of the 20th century. So this also resulted in the emergence of a new class of people called the neo-literates, because until then only people from a certain caste community were able to access education. But towards the later half of the 20th century, there was a certain democratization of education and the emergence of the neo-literate communities in Kerala. So the emergence and proliferation of Ma periodicals coincides with the emergence of this particular group of people. So But nevertheless, the Ma periodicals, which is derogatively called so due to the common initial syllable Ma, shared by the popular periodicals like Malayalam Manorama, Manorajam, and Mangalam, were derided for their cultural and aesthetic penchant for serialized fictions published within these periodicals. These novella or serialized fiction are commonly referred to as Pangli, which means nightingale, to denote, I quote, an allegedly sensuous habitat of reading with formulaic long tales, ordinary readers, and its non-serious writers. And prominent Malayali literary critics also justified the derogatory naming of Pangli literature owing to its deliberate evasion of complicated and disheartening social issues. Then, as part of the attempts to understand what kinds of women's magazines have been archived in these libraries, the questions that were asked were, does the library archive women's magazines? If so, what are some of the women's magazines archived by the library? Second question, does the library archive any of the magazines that are derogatively called Ma periodicals? If not, could you please provide the reasons? So in response to the first question, it was observed that certain periodicals like Sharada, Lakshmi Bai, and Mahila Reknam, which were published from 1905 and 1906 respectively, have been archived in some of these libraries. Again, the same observation could be found here as well. That is, these magazines had a certain pedagogical function. It tried to educate women on how to be an ideal Malayali woman and how to fashion themselves in accordance with the socio-cultural ethos of the state. So it was also community oriented, and it tried to address the concerns of the higher upper caste and upper class groups. So again, the same kind of receptivity, the high receptivity that these magazines had in the social culture space of Kerala is also one of the reasons why it was easier for the libraries to access and archive these magazines. And coming to Ma periodicals. So here I'm trying to juxtapose Ma periodicals with certain other high-end contemporary women's magazines like Vanita and Grihalakshmi. So as certain studies have already indicated, Vanita and Grihalakshmi are certain high-end magazines that try to cater to the interest of the middle class or the upper middle class women. On the other hand, Ma periodicals try to cater to the sensibilities of the lower class and lower middle class women. And it was found that almost all the libraries subscribed to magazines, women's magazines like Vanita and Lakshmi, but only two of these libraries have a solid archival policy that tries to preserve Vanita and Lakshmi. On the other hand, surprisingly, none of the libraries that were taken for the study subscribe or archive Ma periodicals. And the lack of informative content and the predominance of serialized fiction was unanimously cited as a reason for discontinuing the subscription to these magazines. On going through the contents of certain Ma periodicals, again, it becomes very evident that the reading community that it tried to address is quite different from the reading community of periodicals like Vanita and Grihalakshmi, because the coarse, flaky, and smudged papers of Ma periodicals is in stark contrast with the glossy white papers of Vanita and Grihalakshmi. So again, Ma periodicals were cheaper and more affordable as compared to the other periodicals. So it speaks about a certain, in a way we can connect consumption practices and class affiliations here. And so, given that the distinct aesthetics of the Ma periodicals reveal some vital cues about its intended consumers and the socio-economic affiliations, it is imperative to think of the low cultural value of these magazines. If the low cultural value of these magazines could be associated with the low cultural value of its intended readers, that is, women from the lower socio-economic echelons of Kerala, and women who are often cited as credulous, irrational, and puerile. Coming to the concluding part. Thomas Osborne, while speaking of the archives, talks about the discriminatory gaze that is able to isolate on the basis of experience and example items of significance out of a mass of detail. The present paper attempted to see if the discriminatory gaze of the archivist is mediated by some class and gender impulses. By looking at the materials that have been preserved in various public archives in Kerala, and by pitting them against women's magazines and Ma periodicals in particular, it is possible to discern the cultural and literary hierarchies often influence archival policies. This is because Ma periodicals are often excluded from archiving practices owing to their low educational value and socially irrelevant content within single quotes. Uh, by archiving prominent periodicals that capture the dominant ideologies, political thought, and literary sensibilities while strategically excluding others, citing infrastructure limitations, the politics of intellectualism that decide the archival worth of print materials becomes very visible. As Jason Jacobs observes in the context of televisual archives, the danger of such exclusionary archival policies is that history gets reconstructed around what survives for viewing, in this case, reading, rather than what was actually shown or published. Such archival practices often run the risk of obliterating the reading cultures of women from certain socioeconomic backgrounds. Thank you. Ma'am, thank you for the question. In fact, there are certain person collections or people who are interested in collecting Ma periodicals per se. But the thing is that they collect these materials for out of their personal satisfaction. So most often it may not be available for public consumption, and it's also difficult to trace who are these people who are interested in collecting them. So as researchers, it's often very difficult to get hold of people who get hold of these private antiquarians. So I think there is a difficulty that way, but there might be certain personal collections available here and there. But my contention is that, well, it should be available for public consumption, it should be available in public libraries or in places where everyone could access it. Because if that doesn't happen, then maybe it will be omitted from mainstream studies, I would say. By mainstream studies, I'm not trying to say that a certain kind of study should be idealized or anything, but suppose if I'm going around, as is the case now, I'm researching on this particular topic. Oftentimes, it's difficult to understand who are the people who are interested. So we might have to trace these people from Facebook profiles or Insta IDs. So and maybe the list of items that they might have collected out of their fascination for these objects, well, it could also be incomplete, so to speak. So that is one of the reasons why it is important that there should be public archives that access these materials and make it accessible for posterity. Because if that is not available, then one particular problem that I face in this particular research is that it's quite difficult for us to have a complete understanding of how exactly women were fashioned in this particular time. If the high-end magazines are the only ones that are available for public consumption, then people tend to assume or make assumptions about how women are fashioned by social culture discourse on the basis of these magazines alone. So I believe that all these magazines ought to be made available. So since it is not available, the only thing that we could do is to theorize the absence itself, to understand why these magazines were not archived, or why it was assumed that this doesn't have a certain kind of a social cultural clout as compared to other magazines like other magazines that I've mentioned in the presentation. So I think it's very important to theorize the absence itself if we cannot do anything about the absence per se.